This is a critical briefing from the international geopolitics. In today's briefing, we examine the global AI race, the role of international standards, norms, power, and regulatory inequalities. The global AI race is often described as a competition over innovation. However, in practice, it is increasingly a competition more than anything else, a competition over who gets to set the rules that govern AI. When it comes to AI, we often hear public government speak of leadership, competitiveness, and trust. Now, private enterprises, companies, and corporations will typically speak of safety, AI risk management, and alignment. But beneath this shared vocabulary between the private and the public entities lies a less visible struggle or tussle. Now, that is the struggle over standard, compliance, and capacity. So, in today's briefing, we examined how global AI governance is being organized, not primarily through binding international law or treaties, but through standards and frameworks that usually appear neutral and technical, and sometimes even voluntary. A key question that we would like to address in this briefing is simple yet crucial, and that is, if AI governance is global in its ambition, why does it operate so unevenly in practice? Over the past decade, or perhaps over the last few years, I should say, AI governance has clearly shifted away from formal treaties and more towards softer instruments like stating or creating principles, developing international or governing frameworks, and creating technical standards. Um, these instruments include, for example, the OECD AI Principles, for instance, the ISO and the IEC standards on AI systems, the national risk management framework, such as those developed by NIST in the US, and most prominently, the European Union's AI Act. Now, together, these instruments form an emerging global governance architecture for AI. However, they do not necessarily apply equally everywhere. Um, but nonetheless, they increasingly function as a reference point in the absence of nothing else. In other words, they serve as benchmarks which against which the so-called responsible AI discourse is often measured. Now, standards do matter because they translate or help translate abstract values into operational requirements. They define documentation practices, audit procedures. They can also help with the classification of risk and reporting of and create sort of like reporting obligations for states and entities, other entities. You know, in other words, they they can help shape how governance is done in practice, basically. And most crucially, they do so without the need for a universal agreement. In other words, there's no, it can still function even though um, not everyone is in full agreement of a particular instrument. Now, while we see standards often described as technical tools, they are nonetheless political instruments as well. And this is because they govern directly, they govern indirectly by um, shaping markets, shaping compliance cost, or determining compliance cost and access. However, to comply with an AI standard often requires expertise. Institutional coordination is needed. Data infrastructure has to be in place, and sustained um, regulatory capacity is needed on the part of the state or body that is choosing to comply to with such standard. Now, for large technology firms and well-resourced states, these requirements are manageable, but not so much so for smaller firms or developing nations and all other under-resourced regulators who, for them, the requirements can be overwhelming and even prohibitive. This therefore immediately creates a sort of structural asymmetry or a playing field that one could say is definitely not level or even. Here we see governance becomes less about formal sovereignty and more about practical and material capability, which means that those who can afford compliance will eventually be among those who help define what compliance means, while those who cannot um are positioned as rule takers as opposed to being the ones who help set these rules. And this is precisely how governance travel without cohesion, not just in relation to AI, governance more generally, if anything, and and without representation as a result for those who are positioned as rule takers rather than rule setters. So regulatory inequality does not necessarily mean the absence of regulation. It just means that there is unequal capacity between entities to regulate, enforce, and adapt. The EU Act, AI Act, for example, um, is often described as a global gold standard for AI. Now, one could say that's fair enough because a lot has indeed been put into it, but its extraterritorial influence or the ability of its adaptability beyond EU borders depends on the ability of other states to align with it. And alignment, for, as we know, for most states is just simply too expensive. It requires legal harmonization, their technical expertise, and above all, it requires them putting enforcement infrastructure in place. Now, for many states, particularly developing states in the global south, the choice is not between different regulatory models, but between partial alignment and exclusion. So what we find, therefore, is that we end up with a form of governance that is formally or looks all inclusive, but substantively uneven. Now, what all this means is that if AI governance continues to be organized primarily through norms that are set through standards and frameworks, etc., the key question becomes not who writes the rules, but who can realistically follow or adopt them. So it therefore raises a deeper concerns about representation, accountability, and above all, global inequality. The AI race, then, one could say, is not simply about innovation leadership. It becomes more about those whose who regulatory models travel and whose capacities are taken or can be taken for granted. So, in conclusion, therefore, it is important that understanding AI governance, therefore, requires looking beyond laws and principles, standards and frameworks, and more towards the infrastructures and power relations that make governance possible in the first place. Now, this briefing is part of an ongoing series examining power, governance, and global political order. And for the further briefings, we will follow.